everyone. Today I have with me author, reporter, historian, television news reporter, Jack Bohrer. And Jack has just written his first book called The Revolution of Robert Kennedy. Thank you so much for talking to me today, Jack.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
My favorite topic is the Kennedys. So I'm 52, but back in the 80s after high school, because we didn't learn that much about the Kennedys, I started reading books on the Kennedys, like one after another, as many as I could get my hands on back in those days. And when I saw this, I'm not even sure where I saw this pop up. I think it was my Amazon. I was like, oh my God, I have to read this book. And I hadn't read a Kennedy book in a long time. And I realized after reading it that I didn't know as much about Bobby as I thought I did. And I am so happy that you wrote this book.
Thanks. Yeah, I tried to go for a period of his life that I felt was overlooked. So there's the presidential campaign and the White House from 1960 to 1963. Those years, the Camelot years, pretty well documented. A lot of momentous stuff happened then. Then the 68 presidential campaign as well, also a well-known period of his life, a very dramatic period of his life, and also what ultimately ended in his death. But there's this period between that where I found Robert Kennedy's life kind of took its shape from someone who followed the direction of his family, followed his brother, and who had that kind of constant in his life, to then having to make decisions for himself and to become his own sort of political leader and person. And it was, I think, a fascinating, probably overlooked journey, especially, too, because Robert Kennedy was so well covered at that time, and there was so many documents and resources and news clippings to go through to really piece it together almost day by day the way you would a modern political article or journey or like that. So it was easy to report once you collected everything and got to look at everything. And then with the benefit of being 50 years later, you can go back and look at what they were saying privately or writing privately and to really suss out the true story.
I have to say, when I was reading it, after, when you pick up when Jack gets shot, okay, and what I never read a book before about what Bobby went through. And I found myself getting so emotional about his journey from that day, I should say like the first 6 months. I never had read anything so chronicled that you wrote about and what he went through during that time frame. And I was reading it, and I'm like, wow, I was getting so emotional. Like, you really got into how it must have been for him to figure out what he was going to do during that time.
Yeah, I mean, when you think of it, too, from the JFK angle, so he's going through his life. Within a few days, his brother's buried. It's a national event. Millions of people watch on television. Everywhere he goes, people want to talk to him and say something about his brother and to mourn with him. He becomes, as one person describes, like a walking touchstone of the national pain. They think of it this way. On November 18th, his brother was alive. On December 18th, they're putting his face on money, and they're naming an airport after him, and in New York City. And Robert Kennedy's going through all of these tributes. All of these people who feel it very personally because the president is one of the most personal people we have in American politics and in American life. They're constant. You can judge basically every sort of stage of your life by who was president and who was speaking and coming into your home on a near daily basis or on these major national events. So Robert Kennedy, he looked like JFK. He sounded like JFK. People, it was haunting. And you even look at the cover of the book. I mean, I think that, too, evokes JFK in a lot of ways. It's a photograph taken by a man named Steve Shapiro, who's still working. He lives in Chicago now. It's a photo of Bobby riding in an open car in a convertible, much like JFK was riding in when he died. there are all these people reaching out to him. He's very exposed. He's very vulnerable. You see how vulnerable he lets himself be. There are people on a rooftop in the distance, which kind of evokes that sense of danger as well that JFK experienced. But the thing about that photo that I find really interesting is that it's not from 1968, that presidential campaign. It's actually from 1966, which is sort of the period that my book ends in. Because I take you through that little window of his life before he goes off and fully rebels on Vietnam and runs for president. But I think you get to see that this is who he became in that time. And, Bobby Kennedy was not, at the start of this journey, the person he was at the end, even in the public perception. He was always considered very ruthless. He was the brother's campaign manager, tactician, the person who said no when JFK was saying yes. And that was not an easy person to be like, not an easy job to carry, a burden. But he did it. And even after his brother died, there were certain people who still thought Bobby was ruthless and believed in politics over principle. But Bobby got to show over time that he was, there was a deeper element to him. There was someone who had beliefs and who would fight for causes and even, losing causes in cases like that. So, which, you wouldn't think of for a political opportunist to take on a losing battle. But he did. And he also, people really felt connected to him.
Yeah, and I love in your book how you said, and I hadn't seen this before, maybe not in a long time, but I like how you said that people would go to Jack to state their cause, and he would kind of nod at them and send them down to Bobby, who then said no. Like he was the no man,
Yeah, and that's not a popular person. People would say, Bobby did this to me, and that was to say JFK wouldn't have done it to me. The president would have given me what I wanted. I'm powerful. I'm important. And so Bobby they put that on Bobby that whatever went wrong, it was his fault. So, and he played that role happily because it was doing the service of his brother. He never thought it otherwise. It was part of the deal. So.
But what I loved about him as I'm reading your book and kind of experiencing him on a different level, and then going to YouTube, and of course there's so much stuff you can now pull up on YouTube of their old family movies, is that when you think of JFK, you don't really think of him as the family guy that Bobby was. With the marriage to Ethel and then all the kids coming, and you always see him like carrying 2 or 3 children at a time, would be the picture, op that they would send out. But he went for that big family atmosphere that he grew up in.
Well, he
more
was
than JFK
the seventh of 9 children, and he was the first to have he had the first Kennedy grandchild for Joe and Rose.
Right.
He eventually had 11 children, but when you think about, he married very young. He started having children very young. Jack, married when I believe he was in his mid-30s and didn't have children until he was in his late 30s. So, you have those two. You have that kind of that contrast there. Bobby was the person who was so dedicated to family, and JFK was a little bit cooler, a little bit more detached, seemed to be what they felt like, a romantic, where Bobby was very much a plain, kind of traditional person. And so, he didn't have any of that kind of mystique that JFK had in that way. So he wasn't not living the bachelor life.
Right.
So it was, he was a traditional person. He seemed like he had very rigid values and a rigid set of ideas about how family is. So.
And I kind of love that about him, because it didn't seem, a lot of times with JFK and, some of the books that I've read, like his marriage to Jackie was, sometimes distant, sometimes close, they had their moments. But with him and Ethel, it seemed more like it was real. Like it wasn't fake. It wasn't,
That's a very good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things I discovered in doing the research was people write a lot about the closeness between Jacqueline Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy after JFK's death, especially. Even before, there were moments where, RFK was there in the hospital for her when one of her babies was stillborn in 56. And Bobby was always the person she went to, she knew to go to in a crisis, because he was just the solid, steady person. After the assassination, people talk a lot about the relationship between RFK and Jacqueline Kennedy, and sometimes they talk about it in a sexual way, or were they having an affair? Some people I spoke with had suspicions about that. Some people who knew them very well believed it too. But the thing I was most shocked by or surprised by was how Ethel was really the person who brought Bobby back from the brink of depression, whereas Jackie would mourn with him more, and they really connected over that shared sense of loss and mourning. Ethel also shared the sense of loss, but she had a very deep faith in God and believed that life goes on and you have to keep moving forward. And she always pulled him back, and she was always a candle to him and a light, where to pull him away from the darkness. And I think that he probably would not have been the person he would have been and ended up being, were it not for that influence in his life for that person. She reminded him of the present, not the past, and that's really what he ended up living for. The present, and what he had to do with what had been left to him instead of wallowing. He said in his 1964 Senate race that he could have, run his flag up the flagpole and talked about, spend the rest of his life telling stories about how he saved the country, like so many other White House veterans. But he went back into the fray in the way that so many who experience that sort of power and who get to that height in American government never do. They never really go back. He enters the Senate ranked 99th out of 100. And that's a major step down. I mean, to be a United States senator is a great position for anyone, but for him, he had been assistant president, he had been Attorney General of the United States, and his brother's the president's closest advisor on foreign policy and on domestic policy. You don't get a lot of that, and I think that's one of the things that people ask me about Robert Kennedy. What changed in him? Did he become more religious? Did the Greeks, he's reading about Greek tragedy, did that affect him? I think he was always a person who was building and learning upon his experiences. But I think really, if you want to look at the biggest change, it's you had this person who understood inside power and the establishment so well, who was then suddenly ripped from power and had this new sort of empathy for people who had never come that close or experienced it. And he was able to help them understand, I think, what they had to do. He brought institutionalism and idealism together in a way that I think created a special mix that people still yearn for. They want that kind of leadership. They want that kind of person who's able to affect change, but also is not afraid of change. I really feel that the biggest thing Robert Kennedy did was make Americans less fearful of change in their lives. He looked like the Kennedy who brought them into the decade, but he wore the hair of someone who looked like he had actually learned from it. And I always feel that Robert Kennedy began that period of his life really not sure of what he had to do, and made some decisions that probably he would have regretted had he been successful at what he was trying to do. But ultimately, he realized that change is going to come, and we have to deal with it. It's our responsibility. It's because change is the increasing speed of change as well was something he also grappled with for people.
Yeah, and another reason why I feel like it was so real with him was, I always think about, say JFK wouldn't have died, say Jack would have lived, right? Bobby would have never gotten to be the person that he was really meant to be. He would have always been that brother kind of helping his older brother.
In the shadow.
In the shadow, even though he got to step forward and find himself through the tragedy of it, which I loved. I loved how you walked through his finding his own voice and figuring out what he really was interested in, which was the civil rights, and figuring, like kind of figuring out on his own what he was going to do to try to change. Because he even said in the Q&A that he had at Columbia, which I love when somebody asked him, is this just a stepping stone? What are you trying to do here, when he was running for Senate? And he was like, look, I could just walk away from you. Like, I can just go and, my dad's made a lot of money. I don't have to do this. I don't have to, be here.
Yeah.
And, and that's when it's like people started to respect him, I think. I think he said it so well that you could hear it from his soul. Like, I want to be here. I don't want to just walk away. And because he could have very easily have done that. And, but anyway, my point was that I was watching an interview that Rory had done with Ethel just a couple of years ago for HBO, and it was on YouTube. And I love the fact that, like, Ethel continued on she stayed with and made sure those kids stayed with the things that Bobby cared about. She sent them out and kind of held it as her responsibility, where Jackie, she married Onassis and just kind of like disappeared into, she wanted to save her kids. She was afraid of the whole political, it scared her. So she took her kids and moved and, took them away, where Ethel, she didn't leave and she sent those kids out. I couldn't believe the things that she did with those kids as teenagers, but she believed in everything Bobby stood for and wanted them to continue it on.
Yeah, I think you see that in the book, too, from Robert Kennedy's point of view after the assassination. So he knows he wants to continue on with what JFK had done, and he writes about that in that memorial edition of the Profiles in Courage. He wrote the foreword for it. But the problem he has, I think, initially is he doesn't know how to do it. And so he decides that the best option he has to continue with what JFK wanted is to be Lyndon Johnson's vice president, which sounds totally insane, given what we know now about how their relationship would turn out and how their relationship was even beforehand. But he thought, well, this is the way I'm going to return the Kennedys to power someday, so I have to do this. Because even in that Columbia speech, he talks about how where would I go if using a stepping stone to what? He's like, Lyndon Johnson's going to run for re-election in 1968, and I have to run for re-election in 1970 if I win here, so I still have to be a good senator for you. But so he really is thinking long-term, or at least everyone thinks in long-term. It's very much like modern politics, where people think about, the next chess move and all these steps ahead. So Robert Kennedy, he pursues the vice presidency. He does a lot more than anyone had ever really known before about in his quest for that. Because you also have to remember, a lot of the people who wrote the histories of Robert Kennedy and his life were friends of his, or had some sort of stake in it, or also were looking at it at the broad brush of it. So they weren't looking at it down to this sort of micro level of, well, this was a very brief period and it moved on. So by going in deep and going into the records in the archives, I was able to uncover all this contact he had and all these plans that were made and how he followed them and the polling and everything like that. But Lyndon Johnson ultimately was not going to take Bobby Kennedy, and he removed him from contention, removed him from being the vice presidential nominee, which if he had gone forward, and if you go on YouTube and watch the clip of him speaking at that convention in 1964 in Atlantic City, the crowd goes wild for 12 minutes, longer than that almost, just screaming and chanting. If they had done that presentation when it was originally scheduled, before the nominations, Bobby Kennedy's people could have very well made a play to nominate him for vice presidency, to sweep the nomination and to bring him in there. But he doesn't do that, and he then goes, he's it's a backup plan to run for the Senate, but he does it anyway, and that's where he begins to discover his, independent path a little bit more.
It was almost like I loved it in the book also because I really have never read such an in-depth of the relationship between Johnson and him. And it almost made me feel bad for President Johnson because he just didn't know what to do with him, because he was always going to look like the bad guy because here he has this brother that everybody loves,
Yeah, so LBJ is such a complicated figure. You do feel sympathy for him because he's never as smooth. He's not as well educated or doesn't have that pedigree. People find him very folksy. People find him, in comparison with JFK, to be, in a word, unpresidential. He's boorish. He lifts his dog by their ears. He's so folksy. And the thing really though is that he is a master political operator, and you can't really feel that bad for him because he's so conniving in the end. And he does the things like moving the tribute to JFK earlier, or later actually in the week, so that it's after the nominations. And he says to his aide on the telephone call about the columnist who reported it, saying, "Mary McGrory got her story. Who do you reckon told?" He is using the FBI to spy on Bobby.
Yes.
He knows where he is. I mean, so Bobby's in his day calendar. I looked. He's having lunch with the Wall Street Journal. That very hour, LBJ saying, "Well, he's with the Wall Street Journal right now." The way LBJ knew was because FBI agents protected the Attorney General, who was technically their boss, their direct report. So he had the FBI director going around telling him where Bobby was whenever he needed to, reporting back on Bobby's movements, all that kind of stuff. You can't really feel too bad for the guy because he was using all the levers of power to keep an eye on his opponents and ultimately to keep power was his aim. And he was also very insecure, and to a point where he was vindictive. And what Bobby most of all didn't like about him was how he treated the people who were loyal to him, to LBJ, the closest staffers he had, the people who've been working for him for decades, day in and day out, who he sits down with Bobby, and Bobby knows their relationship. Bobby knows he's political antagonist, and LBJ badmouths the presidential staff to him, and he thinks, how could he do this to people who are so loyal to him? And that's when he sort of realizes, I could never be loyal to him because he doesn't understand what loyalty is. And it's a poisonous dynamic between the two of them, and it ultimately, that becomes the story of the two of them.
Right. I feel like Johnson did him the biggest favor though, not letting him be vice president because, that wasn't a good place for him, and he would
absolutely
it wouldn't have worked.
It's interesting because a long time ago I looked at the relationship between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton in 2008, 2009, and the relationship between LBJ and RFK. And I thought that Obama made a smart move by taking Hillary Clinton out of the Senate and they'd run a very tough campaign against each other. And some Democrats looked to her for leadership more than they looked to Obama. And he brought her into the fold so that she couldn't really speak out against him. She couldn't do what Bobby Kennedy ultimately did in the Senate with Lyndon Johnson. And ultimately it didn't work out very well for Hillary Clinton because she got wrapped up in the State Department and all these sorts of scandals and things like that ultimately ended up hurting her future bid for the presidency. And so,
right.
Yeah, I sort of see that. Yeah, of course, Bobby benefited ultimately in his development by not becoming LBJ's vice president or even in LBJ's government, because he would have been much more restricted in what he was doing and saying.
Right. Well, and I never really understood. I loved how you wrote about his climb up Mount Kennedy, because I didn't ever really pay attention to it. In the other books, it was kind of just a side note of something he did, and I loved reading about it because, you take a guy who's really not a climber, okay, and he like
Yeah.
on this, I was like, he was so determined to whatever he was going to do. He was just very determined guy.
Yeah, and it was so dangerous too.
Right.
For someone who was an amateur. And also, you kind of remember a couple months earlier, the president's, his brother died. And so
right.
people are very concerned about, him getting killed. I mean, he volunteers a couple months later to be ambassador in South Vietnam. And LBJ, one of his chief reasons for not sending him was he could get killed. And I couldn't, he's like, I couldn't live with myself if he were killed. And the country couldn't stand it if he were killed. And you really see how dangerous it was, and plunging through the ice at certain points, and it was not something that you would necessarily think a father of. I think at that point he had 7 kids, maybe 8.
Right.
But he did it. So,
what do you think the motivation? I mean, he said he wanted to be the first to do it,
right?
But what was that? I was thinking he didn't have to. Nobody said, you've got to go climb, they named it after him, so you have to go climb this. I don't know. I was thinking, what was his motivation in doing that? Good press?
Partly it was, but this is the thing. He wanted to be the first to climb it. There was one of the, I think he felt a major tribute. It was, he enjoyed those sorts of feats of athleticism. And not long after he did that, one of his advisors, the guy who ended up becoming his 1968 presidential campaign manager, Fred Dutton, wrote him a memo saying, you should take on these sorts of strenuous activities every 6 months or so. Go whitewater rafting, or go on a safari, or do something that's challenging and shows your youth and exertion, things like that. It's the reason why he went, kayaking in the Amazon, and would later, be taking all of these rafting trips through Colorado and things like that, because it showed that he was an adventurous person and not afraid. He's living the life of adventure instead of the life of ease.
Well, I do think that we like our leaders to be, that was what a draw for Obama, when he'd go play basketball, or, we kind of like that little bit of, oh, look at it, they can do stuff, besides just sitting.
Yeah, they're either adventurous, or they're fit, or they're young, and they're
right.
not consumed by their job. I mean, you look at the same thing sort of with Paul Ryan too, and his forecast you hear about so much.
So
it humanizes them.
What did you love about researching him? Did you find out anything that just shocked you, or did you feel like you knew most of it?
It's hard to say now, because it was all sort of a gradual, uncovering. It was like resanding a beach, because so much had happened in his life that was newsworthy, and people were just interested in everything. I guess one of the things I was surprised about was that he had, just a few months after the assassination in January of 1964, sought out a speech coach to begin taking speech lessons so he could become a better presenter, because I think he knew he was going to be running for office soon.
Yeah.
So that was surprising, that the Attorney General would fly up to New York City to go to a studio on the East Side and just learn how to become a better public speaker. I think the things that were surprising to me were how much he dove into these sorts of issues in the Senate, whether it was education policy, which I didn't really know much about as far as his interest in it, and how he went on to sort of find these other little avenues where he could make the most difference, because not having much seniority in the Senate, not having a chairmanship or anything like that, he could still take over these debates just by the dint of his celebrity. And he used it to really great effect. I mean, for these children in these homes, for these disabled children in New York State who are living in really terrible conditions, he surprised the state hospitals and would show up and do inspections and discover and then expose and then speak out about how terrible these conditions were, and through that he was able to make a very big difference. And he did that for Cesar Chavez's union out in California, who were being pushed around by sheriffs who were in the pockets of the growers. And he would just go on to do that, even on issues like Vietnam, where he did not feel any great kinship with protesters. I quote him saying, those are the people with the long hair and the beards. I'm not their Wayne Morse, referring to a very anti-war senator. He was just trying to do what he felt was right from the beginning. And he realized that if I speak out, I could make a difference and people will pay attention. And even the speech that I end the book with, the Ripple of Hope speech, these are kids, these are children in South Africa, really, who are fighting an oppressive government and this racist regime, and they have no support. They have literally one member of parliament is simpatico with their interests. The government in South Africa tries to stop him from coming. They reschedule things. They try to use this hospitality excuse that they can't extend to him the proper welcome. But he's persistent, and he goes, and he speaks out, and the message he gives to them is that ripple of hope message, that each time a man stands up for an ideal or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope that, crossing each other from 1,000 different points of energy, can create a current that sweeps down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. And in that he's saying, not everyone can bend history, but you must try. And even if you do something small, it will build as a part of a great movement and really make a difference. And I think that's really what he tried to impress upon people. And so when I talk about how he made people less afraid and less fearful of change, that's really what I'm getting at, is that, he said things are changing faster than we've ever experienced before. And you can be a part of it. You can do something positive in change and not just sort of hide under the bed and fear for and long for the past. So I think that really was the message of his life.
Right, and I love that that one of his children, you quoted one of the children, like he had come back, they were living in New York, and he had gone to visit one of those hospitals, and he came in and his children were sitting there getting served by servants underneath a chandelier, and he, stops at the table and says, "You have no idea how lucky you are. Remember that and do something with it," and kind of walked away. And, like he took it so to heart. It wasn't just nothing to him. He understood how privileged he was and that there were people out there suffering, and he took it, very personally and wanted to do something about it.
And instill a sense of service. You get that from the very beginning of the book, and you still see it in the end. That really is the constant there.
Yeah.
That he wanted to serve, and he believed in that in the end. So
yeah. Well, I am
had to find
happy.
the right way to do it.
Right. I'm so emotional about your book because it made me, when I got done with it, and I was shocked. I have to say that when you didn't cover, when you did stop in 1966, I was like, oh, I really thought you were going through, until up until the assassination. So I was shocked, but then I was like, oh, but that was, you did cover the years of the making of, basically, of Bobby Kennedy, and I loved it so much, and I can't wait to share it with everybody because I think it'll be a book that anybody who wants to know anything about the Kennedys will just love.
Thanks, appreciate that.
So, do you have anything up for a next book, a next topic, and is it Kennedy related?
I thought I might do something about the Kennedys again, or about Robert Kennedy, and cover something else in his life. Though right now I'm looking at something a little bit more modern. I'm not really yet ready to say what it is. I'm just still sort of figuring it out. I have papers in front of me right now.
Oh, Well, you are a tremendous writer. I mean, like I said, it was just a page turner from the beginning. I devoured every page of it, and I'm so happy that I got to talk to you today about it. It thrills me. I mean, it's one of my favorite topics to talk about anyway. But I learned so much about Bobby, and it forced me to go look up the videos and to watch some stuff again, and then to really relive like what he was about. And I'm so grateful for that.
Great. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Yes, thank you. And I can't wait to see what's up next. So you can share anytime. Thank you so much, Jack. Have a great day.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.